The woman in seat 14C is laughing. Not a nervous laugh. Not the kind that escapes you when turbulence catches you off guard. This is a full-throated, deliberate, performative laugh. The kind that fills a pressurized cabin at 35,000 feet and bounces off the overhead bins and makes every single passenger within 4 rows turn their head. She is laughing at a photograph. A small, laminated photograph clutched in the hands of the man sitting beside her in 14A. A man wearing dark glasses. A man with a white cane folded beneath the seat in front of him. A man who has not said a word in response. A man whose jaw is set so still and so tight it looks carved from stone. United Airlines Flight 1147, Chicago O'Hare to Washington Dulles, Airbus A321, 187 passengers aboard. Scheduled departure 7:42 a.m., cruising altitude 35,000 feet somewhere over West Virginia. And the woman in 14C is still laughing. "Is that your dead wife?" she says, loud enough for the entire section to hear. "You carry around a dead woman's picture? That's so. I mean, that's a little creepy, isn't it?" She turns to the man in the window seat to her right, a stranger, looking for validation. The stranger stares at his phone. "Seriously, does the airline know you're traveling with a dead person's photo? Maybe they should charge it a ticket." The man in 14A does not move. His name is Raymond. He is 63 years old. He has been blind for 11 years. He flew 3 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. He was at a ceremony in Arlington just yesterday, placing flowers on a grave, and he has not slept since. The photograph in his hands is of his wife, Margaret, who died 14 months ago of pancreatic cancer, and who used to read him the in-flight safety cards when they flew together because she thought the illustrations were funny. Raymond holds the photograph because in the dark world he now permanently inhabits, holding something she touched is the closest thing left to seeing her face. He still doesn't speak. "Oh my God, you're not going to cry, are you?" the woman says. "In public? On a plane?" And she laughs again. A flight attendant appears at the end of the aisle. Her name tag reads Dana. She has seen a lot in 11 years working for United. She has seen passengers punch each other. She has managed medical emergencies at altitude. She once helped deliver a baby somewhere over the Atlantic. But the look on Dana's face right now, standing at the boundary of row 12 watching what is unfolding in row 14, is not the practiced calm of a cabin crew professional. It is the look of someone who cannot quite believe what she is witnessing. And whatever is about to happen next on Flight 1147, one thing is already certain. It will not end quietly, and it will not end well for the woman in 14C. She just doesn't know it yet. Stay with this story, because what comes next changes everything. Her name was Deborah Whitfield. That was the name she booked the flight under, Deborah R. Whitfield, frequent flyer number UA 887342. Platinum status, which she reminded the gate agent of at O'Hare 3 times in the span of 4 minutes. She was 51 years old, a regional sales director for a pharmaceutical distribution company based in Naperville, Illinois, and she traveled enough that she genuinely believed the rules of commercial aviation were a sort of flexible suggestion designed for other people. Not rude people, not self-important people, just people who weren't as important as Deborah. The morning of Flight 1147 had begun with Deborah arriving at Terminal 1 already agitated. Her black carry-on roller bag was, by any honest measurement, 3 inches too wide for the overhead bin on an A321, a fact she knew perfectly well because she had been asked to gate check it 6 times in the past 2 years. She had learned to board early enough to avoid the conversation. That morning, however, the gate for her flight had changed, a common enough occurrence at O'Hare, and the new gate was a 12-minute walk from the old one, which meant Deborah arrived at the boarding area with Group 2 already moving and no time to insert herself into Group 1 the way she usually did by simply walking past the gate agent with the confidence of someone who had somewhere more important to be. "Ma'am," the gate agent, a young man named Tyler, said pleasantly, "I see you're in Group 3. If you could just—" "I'm Platinum," Deborah said. It was less a statement than a declaration, the way someone might announce they were a citizen of a country with a powerful passport. "Platinum travels with Group 1. Absolutely, and typically that's—" "Typically? It's not typically, it's always. What's your employee number?" Tyler smiled with the patience of someone who had worked airport gates for 4 years and had developed, through sheer necessity, the emotional constitution of a Buddhist monk. He scanned her boarding pass. He let her through. She bumped her oversized roller bag against the arm of a man sitting in the boarding area chairs as she passed, didn't apologize, and marched down the jetway. What Deborah did not know, what no one in that boarding area knew, was that the man in the chairs whose arm she bumped was Raymond Caldwell. He was sitting quietly, white cane beside him, a carry-on at his feet that a United Gate agent had already offered to pre-board for him. Raymond had declined the pre-board. He had flown enough times since losing his vision that he preferred to wait and board with the general flow, orienting himself by the ambient sounds of the cabin rather than arriving into silence. He had a system. Raymond always had a system. Raymond Caldwell had spent 31 years in federal law enforcement before his vision deteriorated beyond what the agency could accommodate in an active capacity. He had served as a special agent, a supervisory agent, then risen through the executive ranks across 2 presidential administrations. But that's getting ahead of things. What mattered on that morning, in that terminal, was that Raymond was traveling alone for the first time since Margaret died, flying back to Washington after visiting her grave on what would have been their 37th anniversary. He had the photograph, the one his daughter had laminated for him, the one he could feel with his fingertips, folded carefully in the breast pocket of his jacket. He found his seat with the help of a flight attendant named Dana, who walked him down the aisle and made sure his cane was stowed safely. He sat. He took out the photograph. He held it. The cabin filled. Row 14 filled. And into seat 14C, pulling her oversized roller bag behind her, wearing noise-canceling headphones around her neck and a blazer that probably cost more than some passengers' round-trip fares, came Deborah Whitfield. She did not acknowledge Raymond. She hoisted her bag into the overhead bin. It didn't fit. She forced it. The bin latch caught at an angle, and sat down with the particular thump of someone who felt the seat owed her comfort. She pulled out her phone. She looked at the man beside her. She saw the dark glasses. She saw the cane. She saw the photograph. "What's that?" she said. Raymond didn't answer immediately. He was a man who chose his words carefully. It was a professional habit, and it had never left him. "A photograph," he said quietly. "Of who?" "My wife." Deborah glanced at it. It was a woman in a garden, laughing, mid-50s, sun on her face. Nothing extraordinary. Just a woman laughing in a garden. "Is she coming on the trip?" Deborah asked. Not friendly, just filling space. "She passed," Raymond said. 14 months ago." There was a pause. A normal person would have said they were sorry. A normal person would have looked away, maybe offered a small nod, the universal acknowledgement that some conversations aren't for airplane seats. Deborah Whitfield was not a normal person. "Oh," she said. And then, a few seconds later, "Kind of weird to carry it around, isn't it?" Raymond's thumb moved slowly across the surface of the laminated photo. He said nothing. Deborah put her headphones on. The plane pushed back from the gate. They climbed through the cloud layer over Lake Michigan. The seatbelt sign clicked off. And somewhere over Ohio, Deborah Whitfield took her headphones off, looked again at the photograph in the blind man's hands, and decided she had more to say. This is the moment everything begins to break apart. She started small. That is often how it goes with people like Deborah Whitfield. Not with an explosion, but with a series of small, sharp pokes, each one calibrated to see how much she could get away with, each one a little bolder than the last. The first thing she said, loud enough to be conversational but too loud to be private, was, "You know they have apps for blind people that describe photos for you, right? You don't actually have to hold the real thing." Raymond did not respond. "I'm just saying it's a little, I don't know, sad? In a weird way, like she's gone. At some point you have to move on." She turned to the man in 14B, a heavy-set man in his 40s with a laptop open. "Don't you think?" The man in 14B chose to become deeply interested in his spreadsheet. Across the aisle, a woman in 14D, a schoolteacher from Cincinnati named Marisol Reyes, traveling to a conference on educational policy, had been watching this with increasing alarm. She caught Dana's eye from down the aisle. Dana was already moving. "Can I get you anything?" Dana said, arriving at row 14, directing the question at Raymond but keeping her peripheral vision on Deborah. I'm fine, thank you, Raymond said. He's fine, Deborah confirmed, as though she had been asked. We were just having a conversation. Wonderful, Dana said, with the specific warmth of a flight attendant who means the opposite. Can I offer anyone a drink? Water, juice. White wine, Deborah said. And I'd like to move seats. I'd like something with more legroom. I can check what's available after the beverage service, ma'am. I'm platinum, Deborah said. I'll check what's available, Dana said. Dana moved to the galley. She spoke quietly to her colleague, a flight attendant named Marcus, who had been with United for 16 years and had a calm that people sometimes mistook for indifference, but was in fact something closer to mastery. Marcus glanced toward row 14. He nodded slowly. Deborah received her white wine. She drank a third of it immediately. The A321 hummed along at Mach 0.82. The engine note a constant low roar beneath the white noise of the air systems, and the cloud cover outside the windows was unbroken gray. Somewhere around the West Virginia border, Deborah turned to Raymond again. Can I ask you something? And don't take this the wrong way. She did not wait for permission. Why are you flying alone? How do you manage? Doesn't someone have to come with you? I manage fine, Raymond said. But practically, how do you know where you are? How do you know what? I've been flying for 40 years, Raymond said. I lost my vision 11 years ago. I've had time to adjust. Sure, but, she shrugged. I just think if I were blind, I'd stay home. I wouldn't put other passengers through the stress of worrying about me. The man in 14B closed his laptop. Marisol Reyes, across the aisle, said, Excuse me. Deborah glanced at her. That was a really unkind thing to say, Marisol said. I'm sorry. Were you part of this conversation? I am now. Well, maybe mind your business. You're conducting your business at full volume in a pressurized tube, Marisol said. Everyone within 6 rows is part of this conversation. And she was right. The couple in row 13 had both removed their earbuds. The teenager in 15B was no longer looking at his phone. The businessman in 12C had turned his head. The cabin had the quality of a held breath, that particular silence that falls over a public space when something is clearly wrong and everyone is watching to see who will act first. Deborah set down her wine. I wasn't being unkind, she said. I was being honest. There's a difference. There isn't, Marisol said. Not always. And then Deborah made the mistake. She turned to Raymond and she picked up the photograph, the one he was holding, the one she reached over and physically lifted from between his fingers before anyone could react. And she held it up and she said, look at this. It's just a picture. It's not her. She's dead. She's been dead for over a year. Carrying this around is... Raymond's hand came up, open, flat. The palm of a man who has been in rooms where the wrong gesture triggers catastrophe. Still, patient, controlled. Please, he said, just that. Please give that back. His voice had not changed in volume. It had not cracked. But something in it, some register that the human ear recognizes instinctively, the frequency of a person exercising enormous, deliberate restraint, made the businessman in 12C stand halfway up from his seat. Deborah held the photograph for one more second. Then she dropped it onto Raymond's lap. The laugh that came after was the one Dana heard from the galley, the one that brought her back into the aisle at something faster than a professional walk. Ma'am, Dana said, I need you to settle down. I haven't done anything, Deborah said. You took something that belonged to a fellow passenger. I was looking at it. That's not illegal. Ma'am, what's your name? What's your employee number? Because I'm going to report this. I'm going to report you and I'm going to report... She gestured at Marisol. Whatever she did, and I'm going to report this whole situation, because I paid for a seat on this flight and I have the right to a comfortable... Deborah. The voice came from Raymond. She stopped. Raymond was sitting with the photograph held against his chest now. He turned his face toward her. Not at her exactly, since he could not see her, but with the uncanny accuracy of a man who had spent years learning to locate people by the sound of their breathing. His dark glasses reflected the cabin lights. His face was entirely composed. "That photograph," he said, "is the last thing I have of someone I loved for 36 years. I held her hand when she died. I gave the eulogy at her funeral from memory because I had written it in my head in the weeks before she passed, in the hospital while I held her hand. I am carrying her photograph because touching it is the only way I can still feel close to her. And I would appreciate it very much if you would stop talking to me." The cabin was silent. Absolutely silent. Even the engine note seemed to recede. Deborah opened her mouth. She closed it. She opened it again. "Well, I didn't know all of that." "Now you do," Raymond said. He turned his face back toward the window. Dana looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the cockpit door. And in the galley, just out of passenger sightlines, Marcus quietly lifted the interphone. This is where it stops being a bad flight and starts becoming something else entirely. What happened in the next 40 minutes on Flight 1147 was, by the accounts of the 14 passengers who later gave formal statements, the most rapidly escalating cabin incident any of them had ever witnessed. It did not escalate because Raymond said anything further. It escalated because Deborah Whitfield, in a move that defied what most behavioral psychologists would call the social correction impulse, that internal mechanism that tells most people to back down after public humiliation, decided she had been wronged and was going to do something about it. She pressed the call button. Marcus appeared within 30 seconds. "I want to be moved," Deborah said. "Away from him. I find this situation, his situation, to be upsetting." "I understand," Marcus said. "Unfortunately, the flight is completely full this morning. There has to be something. Business class. Business class is also full, ma'am. I can check with the purser, but I want to set expectations." "Is there a purser?" "Get the purser." The purser for Flight 1147 was a woman named Angela Reeves, 22 years with United, who had been briefed by Marcus at the galley interphone 7 minutes earlier, and who walked down the aisle with the measured authority of someone who has handled far worse than this and knows it. She arrived at row 14, looked at Deborah, then at Raymond, then at the occupants of the surrounding rows, and she understood the situation in approximately 4 seconds. "Ma'am, I understand you'd like a seat change. Immediately. Our flight is at capacity. There are no available seats in any cabin. Then someone can trade with me." Angela looked around the section. "Is there anyone willing to exchange seats with the passenger in 14C? Silence. Pointed. Deliberate. Communal silence. The couple in row 13 suddenly found their window very interesting. The man in 14B slowly shook his head. Marisol Reyes, across the aisle, looked straight at Deborah with the patience of a woman who had spent 15 years managing 28 9-year-olds at a time and said, "No." Deborah turned red. "Fine," she said. "Fine. I'll sit here. But I'm filing a formal complaint the moment we land, and I want the names of every crew member on this flight, and," she pointed at Raymond, "I want his name too. You can access crew information through our customer service portal," Angela said. "His name," Deborah said. "I want his name." Angela's expression did not change. "Passenger information is private." "Then I'll find it myself." Deborah pulled out her phone and opened the Notes app. She leaned toward Raymond and spoke in the theatrical whisper that is louder than a normal voice. "What is your name?" Raymond said nothing. "I'll find out. People like you always have to get special treatment, don't they? Pre-boarding, assistance, everyone bending over backwards. And then you get to play victim when someone says something honest." "Ma'am." Angela's voice dropped half a register. "I need you to stop speaking to this passenger." "Or what?" "Or I will have to inform the captain. And that initiates a set of procedures I don't think you want initiated." "Inform the captain," Deborah said. "Please, go right ahead." Angela walked to the front of the cabin, and she did exactly that. The cockpit door of an Airbus A321 is reinforced, locked from the inside, opened only upon crew verification. A post-9/11 reality that most passengers never think about. Captain Dennis Fraley, 38 years flying commercial, had been monitoring the situation via the cabin interphone for the past several minutes. He was a quiet man who flew with surgical precision and managed his crew with the kind of authority that doesn't require volume. He listened to Angela's summary. He asked 2 questions. He made 1 call. At 9:23 a.m., somewhere above the eastern edge of West Virginia, the seatbelt sign illuminated and the PA system clicked on. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Fraley. We are currently at cruising altitude and expect to arrive at Dulles on schedule. I do want to address an ongoing situation in the cabin. Federal aviation regulations require all passengers to comply with crew member instructions during flight. Failure to do so is a federal offense, regardless of the circumstances. I'd like to remind everyone on board that our crew is here for your safety first and your comfort second. We will not hesitate to divert this aircraft if the safety or well-being of any passenger or crew member is compromised. Thank you." The PA clicked off. The cabin processed this in silence. Deborah Whitfield looked at the overhead speaker as though it had personally insulted her. "Is that about me?" she said, to no one in particular. No one answered, because yes, and everyone knew it, and no one wanted to be the one to say it. What nobody in the cabin knew, except for 2 people, was that somewhere in the back, in row 28, 2 men in sport coats who had boarded quietly and taken aisle seats on opposite sides of the aircraft had been in contact with each other via text message since shortly after takeoff. They were not together to any casual observer. They were not looking at each other. One of them was reading what appeared to be a paperback novel. The other was looking at his phone. But both of them had been watching row 14 for the last 25 minutes, and when the captain's announcement ended, one of them typed 4 words to the other. "Stand by." Not yet. Their names are not important yet. But they were watching, and they were ready. Back in 14C, Deborah had had enough of being quiet. She had been quiet for nearly 3 minutes, which for Deborah was roughly the equivalent of silent meditation. She turned to Raymond, who had his hands folded over the photograph on his lap, eyes, or rather dark glasses, forward, and she said, "You know this is your fault." Raymond's head turned toward her with that same uncanny accuracy. "They're all treating you like you're fragile," Deborah continued, keeping her voice low now but not low enough. "Like you're made of glass, and you're sitting here letting them, playing the wounded veteran card." "I didn't mention my service," Raymond said. "Playing blind, playing grieving widower." "My wife is dead," Raymond said. "And everyone's falling over themselves, and meanwhile I'm the villain because I said what everyone's thinking, which is that it's strange to—" "What everyone is thinking," Raymond said, with a patience so complete it had its own gravity, "is that you should stop talking." "I know people," Deborah said. "I know important people. And when this plane lands—" "When this plane lands," Raymond said, "I would encourage you to say whatever you feel you need to say to whoever you feel you need to say it to." Something in the way he said it. Not a threat, not a warning, just a statement, calm and even, that landed in the cabin air with the weight of something known. Marisol Reyes heard it. The man in 14B heard it. Angela, who had come back down the aisle and was standing 3 rows up, heard it. And in row 28, a man put down his paperback novel and typed 1 word on his phone. Now, Dana appeared from the galley. Marcus appeared from the rear. Angela came down the aisle, all 3 at once, converging on row 14 with the coordinated, unhurried movement of people following a plan that had already been agreed upon. "Ms. Whitfield," Angela said, "I need to ask you to come with me to the rear of the cabin. I'm not going anywhere. This is not optional. I know my rights on." "Ms. Whitfield." The voice came from the aisle, firm, male, quiet, the kind of quiet that fills up a space entirely. Both men in sport coats were now standing in the aisle, one forward of row 14, one behind it. They had appeared so smoothly that several passengers hadn't registered them moving. "I'm going to need you to come with us." Deborah stared at the nearer man. He held up a credential in a small leather wallet. "Federal issue. Gold badge. Air Marshal," she said. Her voice had changed. "Please come with us to the rear of the aircraft." I haven't done anything. I was having a conversation." "We'll talk about that in the rear, ma'am." Deborah stood. She looked at Raymond. She looked at the air marshals. She looked at the cabin full of people all watching her. And for the first time in this flight, the first time perhaps in a long time, she had nothing to say. She walked to the rear of the aircraft. Raymond sat. He held the photograph. And then something happened that no one expected. The man in 14B, the heavy-set man with the laptop who had said nothing the entire flight, leaned toward Raymond and said, very quietly, "You doing okay, sir?" Raymond turned toward him. For the first time since the boarding door had closed, Raymond Caldwell almost smiled. "Yes," he said, "I'll be fine." The man in 14B nodded. He opened his laptop again, but he didn't look at it. He kept his eyes on Raymond. In the rear of the aircraft, wedged between the lavatory and the last row of seats, Deborah Whitfield was discovering the precise extent of what she had put in motion. Air Marshal Code 7. That was what Marcus had quietly relayed to the cockpit 40 minutes ago. It was the designation for a cabin situation involving a passenger demonstrating a pattern of threatening and disruptive behavior directed at another passenger, elevated to the threshold where law enforcement intervention was warranted. Both air marshals had been briefed. Captain Fraley had authorized. And now Deborah Whitfield stood in the rear galley of an Airbus A321 at 35,000 feet and listened as one of the air marshals informed her that she would be met by law enforcement upon landing at Dulles, and that her behavior constituted potential violations of Federal Statute 49 U.S.C. Section 46,318, the federal interference with flight crew members and attendance provision, as well as civil rights provisions relating to disability discrimination under the Air Carrier Access Act. "Disability discrimination?" she said. "You took a personal item from a disabled passenger without consent, made repeated derogatory comments regarding his disability, and continued after being asked to stop by 3 separate crew members. He can still hear. He can still. Visual impairment is a federally protected disability under the ACAA," the air marshal said. The crew documented the incidents. Deborah's face moved through several expressions rapidly. "I'd like to call someone. You can use your phone once we land. I know people. Ma'am, at this point, I need you to sit quietly in the jump seat and remain calm for the rest of the flight. You will remain here in the rear of the aircraft for the remainder of the flight. Your belongings in the overhead will be retrieved for you at the gate." He pointed to the jump seat. Deborah sat. She was furious. She was frightened. And she was about to discover that she had absolutely no idea who the man in 14A was. Because back in the front of the aircraft, Angela had returned to row 14 and crouched in the aisle beside Raymond's seat. She spoke quietly. "Mr. Caldwell, I want to apologize on behalf of United Airlines for what you experienced today. The situation has been handled." Raymond turned toward her. "Has she been removed?" "She's in the rear galley for the remainder of the flight. Law enforcement will meet the aircraft at Dulles." Raymond nodded slowly. "Thank you. You and your team handled it professionally." Angela paused. It was the pause of someone who has just been assessed and evaluated by a person who knows what professional looks like from the inside. "Is there anything else I can get you?" "Nothing, thank you." Angela started to stand. Then, "Mr. Caldwell, I have to ask, only because it may affect the arrangements at Dulles. Are you able to tell me your destination this morning? Whether you need any additional assistance upon arrival?" Raymond reached into the inner breast pocket of his jacket. He removed not one but 2 items, the photograph and a small folding leather credential. He opened the credential and held it where Angela could see it. Angela read it. Her eyes moved once from the credential to the man's face and back again. "I see," she said. Her voice was very steady. "I'll inform the captain." She walked forward. She knocked twice on the cockpit door. She spoke through the interphone. And 30 seconds later, Captain Dennis Fraley, 38 years of commercial aviation, pressed his forehead very briefly against his hand and said, "Oh my God." At 10:54 a.m., Flight 1147 touched down at Washington Dulles. The jetway was not the usual jetway. There were people waiting at it who were not gate agents. There were more people behind them, a woman in a dark blue FBI jacket, two Dulles Airport police officers, and beyond them, at the end of the jetway, representatives from United's senior operations team who had received a call from the cockpit 40 minutes ago and had been making additional calls ever since. When the aircraft door opened and the passengers began to file off, Deborah Whitfield was escorted from the rear galley first, not off the aircraft, but to the rear of the boarding door queue and told to wait. She watched the passengers file past. Some of them looked at her. Most didn't. Marisol Reyes, the schoolteacher from Cincinnati, paused at the galley door and looked at her for a moment with an expression not of triumph but of something closer to sorrow. Then she walked on. Raymond Caldwell was escorted off the aircraft by Angela and Marcus, white cane in hand, carry-on retrieved from the overhead. At the top of the jetway, he was met by two men he appeared to know. They shook hands. Low words were exchanged. He was led to a private area off the main concourse. Deborah was the last passenger off the aircraft. At the jetway door, the woman in the FBI jacket stepped forward. "Ms. Whitfield, I'm Special Agent Torres with the FBI field office. I need to speak with you." "About what?" "About the incident on Flight 1147, specifically regarding your interactions with a federal official." Deborah blinked. "Federal official? Who? What federal? That blind man. He's a..." "Raymond Caldwell," Agent Torres said, "is the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The jetway was very quiet. The sound of the aircraft ground crew working below drifted up faintly. Deborah's mouth was open. "You," she started. "The director was traveling in a private capacity," Torres continued, "which he is fully authorized to do without announcement. He was traveling on a commercial flight with standard accommodations, same as any other passenger. What he experienced on this flight has been documented in full by 3 United Airlines crew members, 2 federal air marshals who were present on the same aircraft, and at least a dozen passenger witnesses who have already provided contact information." Deborah said, "I didn't know who he was." "That's noted," Torres said. "I wouldn't have if I'd known." "Ms. Whitfield." Torres's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who has had many of these conversations and knows exactly where they go. "Whether or not you knew who he was doesn't change what you did. That's actually one of the things Director Caldwell wanted me to make very clear." This was true, because in the private conference room off the main concourse at Dulles, Raymond Caldwell was sitting in a chair with the photograph of Margaret in his hands, and one of the first things he had said to the United Regional Operations Director who had arrived to meet him, the first thing, before anything about formal complaints, before anything about airline policy, before anything about what happened next, was, "She didn't know who I was. What she did was wrong regardless. I want that understood." The man was 63 years old. He had spent 31 years watching what people did when they thought no one powerful was looking. He knew the difference between a lesson that means something and one that doesn't. The cabin of passengers who witnessed the confrontation had already begun dispersing through Dulles, and the story was moving with them. Marisol Reyes was on the phone with her husband by the time she reached baggage claim. The man from 14B, whose name turned out to be Gerald, a retired high school principal from Columbus, stopped at a terminal bench and typed out a detailed account in his notes app while it was fresh. The teenager in 15B had been discreetly recording audio on his phone since the captain's announcement. He would, in the coming days, have some decisions to make about what to do with it. In the jetway, Deborah Whitfield was handed a printed United Airlines form. It detailed her immediate loss of platinum status. It explained that United was initiating a review under their policies regarding passenger conduct, which could result in permanent prohibition from the airline. It referenced the formal TSA passenger incident report being filed, which would be shared with the FAA and could result in her addition to the federal no-fly database pending review. And it offered a number to call if she had any questions. She stood holding the paper. The jetway emptied around her. She was alone in the corridor between the aircraft and the terminal, and it occurred to her, in a way that had not occurred to her this morning or yesterday, or in a long time, that everything she had just done, every word she had said, every laugh she had performed for an audience that was never going to give her what she wanted, had been done in front of an entire aircraft full of people, all of whom had seen her choose to be exactly who she was, on a morning when she could have chosen. differently. The consequences for Deborah Whitfield arrived the way consequences usually arrive for people who believe rules are for other people, all at once and without sympathy. United Airlines completed their internal review within 72 hours of Flight 1147's landing. Her platinum status was revoked permanently. Her account was flagged in United's incident database, which is shared across several alliance partners under bilateral agreements, meaning the revocation effectively extended to a family of airlines covering roughly 60% of major domestic routes. Her name was submitted to the TSA's Passenger Risk Assessment Program, initiating a review process that, while not automatic, put her in a category of travelers who would face additional scrutiny and documentation requirements for every future flight. The formal federal charges were considered carefully. The Air Carrier Access Act violations were documented. FBI Director Caldwell, in a brief and characteristically measured statement delivered through a spokesperson, indicated that he would not be pursuing personal legal action. He asked that the focus of any institutional response be on the crew of Flight 1147, Dana, Marcus, Angela, and Captain Fraley, who he specifically commended for their professionalism, their judgment, and their protection of passenger dignity under pressure. United Airlines presented formal commendations to all four. Angela Reeves, who had been quietly passed over for a senior purser position 6 months earlier, was told within a week of the incident that the position was hers. The pharmaceutical distribution company where Deborah worked conducted their own review after the story surfaced, not through media, but through the network of traveling professionals who had been on that flight and who talked the way people always talk at conference rooms and dinner tables and over airport terminal food. A formal HR investigation followed. Deborah took an extended leave of absence from which she did not return to her regional director role. Raymond Caldwell flew back to Chicago 4 days later, once his obligations in Washington allowed. He flew commercial, boarded with the general flow, found his seat. He held the photograph for most of the flight the way he always did. The flight was quiet. No one bothered him. The flight attendants checked on him once, with the practiced warmth of people who have been told nothing specific but somehow know. He arrived home in the late afternoon, when the light, he was told, was the particular gold that Margaret had always loved most. He didn't need to see it to know it was there. He could feel it the way you can feel any truth you've carried long enough. The story of Flight 1147 circulated in the way that stories about justice circulate. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but steadily, passed from person to person who nods and says yes. This Marisol Reyes told it at her conference. Gerald, the retired principal, told it to his daughter. The teenager in 15B eventually posted a portion of his audio without names, without identification, and in the comment section below it, thousands of people wrote variations of the same thing. That the detail that moved them most was not the reveal, not the credentials, not the consequences. It was a blind man turning his face toward a window to hold a laminated photograph of his wife, in the silent dignity of someone who had already survived the worst thing that had ever happened to him, and did not need anyone's permission to grieve. This is what it costs to be cruel in a small space to someone you think doesn't matter. And this is why, on every flight you will ever take, on every train, in every waiting room, at every gate, the person sitting next to you is a complete human being with a complete history and a complete grief and a complete set of experiences that you will never know in the 2 hours you share an armrest. The man with the white cane and the dark glasses and the laminated photograph is not asking you to understand him. He is asking only to sit beside you in peace. That is not a large ask. If you felt something watching this story unfold, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are people in your life who fly, who travel, who sit beside strangers on long routes home from heartbreak, and who deserve to be left alone to hold what they love without comment or mockery. Send this to them, not to make a point, just to say, this is what decency looks like, and it matters even at 35,000 feet. Next time on this channel, a first-class passenger tries to have a nurse removed from her seat, and discovers, too late, that the nurse is on her way to testify before Congress about hospital safety laws. That story is coming. Until then, fly safe, be kind, and remember that altitude changes the air pressure, but it doesn't change who you are.